Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
I'm Zara.
The Workplace Gender Equality Agency, WGEA, has released its latest annual pay gap report this week, which found that on average, men still earn more than women across all industries. The agency's gender pay gap target range for all employers is plus or minus 5%. But its latest findings show that just 1 in 5 Australian employers is actually meeting this target. But it's not all bad news, with 56% of employers improving their gender pay gap in the 2023-24 financial year compared to the previous one. In today's deep dive, we're going to take a closer look at these findings to check in with where Australia is at when it comes to the gender pay gap.
If our comment section is anything to go by, which, look, it shouldn't always be something to go by. However, there is a lot of confusion about what the gender pay gap is. And one of the things that always comes up is, isn't it illegal to pay men and women differently for the same job? We're not talking about that. That is illegal. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so it can be a really confusing one, so bear with me. And part of the reason that it is so confusing is that often the gender pay gap is a marker that is measured differently across different reporting and different organisations. But from the outset, as you mentioned, it's important to note we're not talking about men and women being paid differently for doing the same job. That is illegal. That is a form of workplace discrimination. And so what the gender pay gap is referring to is the difference in how men and women are paid across all levels and all industries. So the differences in their earnings. Now, in terms of the WGEA reporting specifically, there are 2 main data sets used to help us understand the gender pay gap. And this will kind of speak to what it actually is, hopefully. Now, the first analysis is the median pay gap within Australian businesses with over 100 employees. And those findings can be used to inform industry-specific trends, broader trends within Australian workplaces. And remembering that median means middle. So if you line up all the earnings from highest to lowest for men and women in a company, you take the middle number of that list for each gender and compare the difference in that number in terms of percentage. You look like you're in physical pain.
No, I was actually just about to jump in because during year 7 maths, I remember learning mean, median, mode.
Yeah.
I had nothing else to contribute. It was just in my head and I didn't know when the right time to say it was.
Everyone brings this song up and it speaks to how little attention I paid in high school maths because I don't remember that song.
Really firmly lodged in my brain. But sorry, we digress. Go on.
So the median metric is part of the gender pay gap reporting. Last year's report was slightly different, but now the annual publication also includes the average remuneration of CEOs, heads of businesses, casual managers, so senior workers within organisations, and that data was previously excluded. So when we're talking about remuneration, we're talking about a combination of earnings, not just salary. So this includes bonuses, superannuation, additional earnings like sales commissions, those kinds of things.
And the inclusion of CEOs is very significant because when you're finding an average, if the top is a lot higher, then that's going to be reflected in the average.
Yes, exactly. And that we're going to get into a little bit more of the data and that kind of speaks to some of the fluctuations that we have seen this year.
Okay, so just to 100% clarify, the gender pay gap is not Sam and I doing the same job but being paid differently. That is not the gender pay gap. What the gender pay gap is measuring is overall across industries, the earnings and the difference in earnings between men and women.
Exactly.
Correct? All right. One other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on before we get to the data itself is who has compiled the data, because as you mentioned at the top, there have been quite a few different metrics for how this is measured, but we now do have this definitive source for Australia's gender pay gap. Talk to me about the WGEA.
Yeah, so that's the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, in case you've forgotten. It's part of the federal government and it's a national body tasked with reducing gender discrimination for workers around the country. In 2023, the government passed legislation requiring businesses with at least 100 workers to disclose their gender pay gap data, and that law mandated that the WGEA would publish that data. So a report last year was actually the first time we had seen this kind of data, that it had been made public, and now that agency has handed down its second gender pay gap report this week. So that legislation is the reason why we only have these 2 years of reporting.
And it should be said, pretty substantial that you've got these companies having to publish this level of data. I've looked at the report. There's a lot there about how some of these bigger companies in Australia, but also some of them aren't that big. 100 employees, it's bigger than the Daily Aus, but it's not massive. And we now have a really full picture of how they're paying their workers, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and for workers in those companies, they can access this public data and compare their employer against other employers across that industry. And the other thing to mention is that a company's progress or standing when it comes to its gender pay gap is measured against this target range. Now, the WGEA says a pay gap between -5% to 5% accounts for normal changes at workplaces, and that's that target range. So the companies that are seen to be behind on their gender pay gap outcomes are companies whose gender pay gaps fall outside that target range.
Okay, so without further ado, there's a lot of data in this report. What do we need to know, though? What are the headlines?
So the results, as you mentioned, this is extensive. The results come from 7,800 individual employers, 1,700 corporate groups. Now, they're parent companies of at least one organisation. So think, Woolworths Group. It owns Woolies, the supermarket, yes, but also it owns brands like BWS and Big W. And this data set applies to more than 5 million Australian employees within those thousands and thousands of companies. Based on that target range that we've discussed, plus or minus 5%, the WGEA found 4 in 5 employers are not meeting that target. In fact, Australia's average gender pay gap for the 2023-24 financial year was 13%.
Just for a listener, and I guess for my sake, what does that 13% actually look like in numbers?
So for every dollar a man earns, women earn 78 cents on average. So 3 in 4 Australian companies pay men more than women on average, with women earning $28,425 less per year. Interestingly, this report also found the higher the average total remuneration at an employer, the more likely that employer is to have a large gender pay gap favouring men. Looking at gender pay gaps favouring men across different industries, I think...
Can I just interrupt you there? Because you keep saying gender pay gaps favouring men.
Yes.
Are there gender pay gaps favouring women?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the 2-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
There were some companies where gender pay gaps favoured women. 6.5% of employers, to be exact. 72% of employers had gender pay gaps that favoured men.
Okay, so the large majority then.
The large majority, exactly. Now, looking at that by industry, in financial services as an industry, 96% of employers had gender pay gaps outside the target favouring men.
Almost all.
Yes, almost all of the financial services industry. Right. In construction, not far behind, with 92% of employers reporting gender pay gaps favouring men. And in retail, this figure was 68%, education 62%. Interestingly, some female-dominated industries there with significant gender pay gaps favouring men. In terms of gender-balanced earnings, though, again, this was in the significant minority, but we saw the public service industry that actually reported gender-balanced earnings across 65% of employers.
Okay, so that's industries. One of the other things that's really interesting in this report, though, is that we do have a company-by-company breakdown. Talk to me about what we found out about these individual companies.
So in terms of some of the companies and bigger brands that TDA listeners might have actually heard of, we looked at companies with more than 250 employees and then sorted that by the highest pay gaps amongst those larger companies. This was some incredible data analysis by our journalist, Harry Sekulich. So thank you, Harry, the numbers man. And he identified an interesting trend with some major women's fashion retailers. Now, that included City Chic, which had a 67% gender pay gap, Sea Folly, which had a 62.2% gender pay gap. I actually looked at our reporting on this from last year, and Sea Folly is up from 44.5% as its gender pay gap. So it's gone backwards to 62.2%. Mimco was on 59.4%. I had a look at the financial services sector because we had that significant 96% industry gender pay gap. An investment bank, Morgan Stanley, reported a 58.6% gender pay gap. And then some huge household companies, brands, names, Jetstar and Virgin, both reported gender pay gaps of around 42%. Now, those numbers were almost identical to Jetstar and Virgin's gender pay gaps for the previous year.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And just to clarify there, we're not saying that the companies that you listed were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the worst ones there. It was just we were picking a handful out of that top cohort that our listeners might be familiar with. But there were also, family holding groups and some mining groups. There are lots of different companies there.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is just, giving a snapshot to paint a bit of a picture to kind of help the average person understand how this works in everyday terms for those, millions of Australian employees.
Em, I want to go back to something you said at the top about the fact that there have been some improvements, perhaps to look at some of the silver lining in this data. Can you take me through that?
Yeah, it's important to note, this isn't all bad news, and the very nature of this reporting, ultimately it's hoped will kind of encourage companies towards progress with their gender pay gaps. And 56% of employers in this latest report actually improved their gender pay gap between the first and the second WGEA report. There was also a significant increase in employers conducting gender pay gap analysis on their pay and composition to find out what's driving these gaps, what's behind some of those significant differences. And consultation within these companies also rose significantly. So we heard from many more employers saying that they have taken steps to talk to their employees to understand these differences better as well. WGEA CEO Mary Wooldridge said it's promising to see the big increase in the number of employers working to understand what's driving their gender pay gap beyond unequal pay. And she added that workplace equality has benefits for all workers. This isn't just about women earning more money. It's about benefits that could change workplaces for everyone, redesigning senior roles to accommodate women on a job share or part-time kind of basis, or redesigning senior roles to be more flexible for parents, whichever gender they are. For men, Wooldridge said that, paid parental leave and paying superannuation on that leave could create a more equal experience. And she added that over the past year, employers have told the agency that the publication of these pay gaps has been a catalyst to assess gender-based differences in all areas of their workplace. So
that's an interesting point there, because it is a fine line, right? Like, I'm sure some employers feel like this is, shaming behavior, or that this is calling them out. Whereas from Mary Woolridge's perspective, she's saying, no, this is actually incentivizing companies to do better.
Yeah. And I think, we can all probably agree that if a company has more flexible policies that are better for all workers there, it's probably going to be a better place to work. You're probably going to have more satisfied and motivated employees. But like I said, Zara, this is just the second year of reporting from the WGEA on this data. So it's going to be really interesting to see how things evolve over the years to come.
And it's fascinating that we now have this landmark, annual metric that we can assess whether there's improvements or whether there's stagnation. Really interesting one. So thank you for explaining that, Em.
Thanks for having me.
That wraps up another episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back again later today with the day's headlines. But until then, have a great Wednesday.